Welcome everyone. In around 5 minutes, we'll start the official introduction for today's webinar, but just in the meantime, we'll let all of the participants trickle in. But thank you for coming today, and we look forward to presenting today's webinar. Okay, I think I'm gonna go ahead and get started now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from Estonian Green Movement. Let's talk solutions, how renewable energy and biodiversity can coexist. My name is Rena Hatton, and I'm an intern with Estonian Green Movement this fall, and I'll be the moderator of today's webinar. This webinar is organized as a part of an ongoing initiative called Citizens Observatory for Green Deal Financing. As for some quick technical information, this event is being recorded, and we will send a copy of the recording and speaker slides shortly after the webinar. Just to give a little introduction about myself, I'm a third year's bachelor student from the US, studying sustainability and renewable energy systems. I'm excited to present today's webinar, looking really in depth on how biodiversity and renewable energy can coexist well. As we are rapidly moving to the transition of using renewable energy systems, it's imperative that we find solutions that work together and protect the nature around us. We have 4 great speakers lined up for you today. First will be Silver Silak with the Ministry of Climate in Estonia. Before that, he researched citizen engagement and energy planning and advocated for better public finance for the energy transition in Estonian Green Movement and CEE Bank Watch. He will be discussing how to work with and reconcile local communities when building wind farms. Then we will have a presentation on biodiversity supporting solar parks by Ingrid Nielsen with Estonian Fund for Nature and Krista Takis with Tartu University. Ingrid Nielsen is a renewable energy advocacy expert and is working on finding better alternatives for our energy needs and safekeeping of the environment. Krista Takis is an expert researcher in restoration ecology at the Landscape Biodiversity Work Group at the University of Tartu. Her research focuses mainly on finding ways to promote biodiversity and ecosystem services in landscape scale. Lastly, we will have a presentation on wind parks through the lens of artificial intelligence by Søren Inghoff. Søren Inghoff is the head of regulatory affairs and impact with SPOR in Denmark and specializes in offshore wind farm project management and permitting. We have a lot to learn from these insightful speakers today, so don't forget to ask questions during the webinar. Please put your questions in the chat, and after the presentations, we'll have a good discussion with all of the speakers. If you have a question for a specific speaker, please put their name in your question. Before we jump into our presentations, we have a short trailer to show you all today. This trailer will introduce and be a short warm-up for the topics discussed in today's webinar. You can see the whole video in EGM social media, on YouTube, Facebook, and our webpage by typing in the search bar biodiversity and renewable energy. This video does a good job of showcasing some problems while finding some solutions at the same time. But today, of course, our main focus is solutions. Anyways, I'll show the video now and let it speak for itself.
Arvestades pikalt kestnud vaidlusi jätkusuutliku raiemahu ja elurikkuse kriisi üle, tõstatab taastuvenergia kiire arendamine valusaid küsimusi selle mõjudest ökosüsteemi hoidmisele. Ometi ei saa me taastuvenergia kiiremast arendamisest üle ega ümber. Selles videos uurime, kuidas saaks taastuvenergia arendamine olla elusloodust säästvam ja toetavam, et kliimaeesmärkide poole pürgimine ei süvendaks elurikkuse kriisi.
Again, if you're interested in finding the full-length video, it will be posted in the chat, and you can find it in EGM social media. Now, Silver, you're welcome to start with your presentation.
Thank you. Can you see it? Okay, let's go. My name is Silver, and as was already said, I'm currently working for the Ministry of Climate in Estonia. However, I have to say right away that this talk does not represent the views of the Estonian government, but this talk is based on my previous work that I did at Aalborg University in Denmark, and also for the Estonian Green Movement. So this talk is based on my previous research. And the topic is how might we reconciliate local communities with renewable energy development, especially wind farms. There is an interesting paradox when it comes to the social acceptance of wind farms. And these are numbers from a recent survey in Estonia, which show that 62%, so a majority of Estonians, in principle support the development of onshore wind farms in order to mitigate climate change. However, only 34% of Estonians are willing to accept living near an onshore wind farm. So people in principle support renewable energy, but they don't want to be nearby. And these are not only things that we see in Estonia, but these are things that we see all over Europe and in many other countries. So there's really a difficult paradox when it comes to renewable energy development. And of course, this has been sort of summarized as the NIMBY effect, short for not in my backyard, which is an understanding that people are simply not willing to accept anything, any sort of development when it is near their home. The sad thing is that this understanding is actually not really true. So of course, there are some people that who are not willing to accept anything, but there is a large majority of people who are willing to accept, for example, wind farm development near their home, but under certain conditions. And the problem is that these conditions often have not been met. This is a recent survey that was done in 3 European countries, in Estonia, in Ukraine, and in Switzerland. So 3 pretty different countries. And the red boxes on the right show the share of people in these countries that are willing to accept the development of a wind farm near their home. And the red boxes on the left show the conditions under which people are willing to do so. So when we go from the top to the bottom, we can see first that people are more willing to accept if the ecological impact of the wind farm is low or almost non-existent. So clearly people are worried about the ecological impact. Of course, they would prefer, secondly, if the wind farm was built on agricultural land or already existing industrial zones, for example. But also, they're willing to accept more if it is a local utility company that's the developer, or it's a local utility company in cooperation with an investor. They're also willing to accept more if revenue is shared. Of course, money talks. If revenue is shared with the local residents or with the municipality. And last but not least, social acceptance is higher when there is proper public engagement. So at least some public informational meetings, but ideally also meetings where people can have a say and they can have a choice in, for example, determining the number or the location of the wind turbines. So these are some of the conditions that make people more willing to accept wind farm development. And it's not just a case of not in my backyard under any under any conditions. What I wanted to shortly talk about is 5 most popular ways of increasing this social acceptance towards wind farms. Firstly, direct financial compensation, community benefit funds, co-ownership, some sort of support for energy communities, and better communication, simply put. First, direct financial compensation. So this means that some amount of the revenue generated by the wind farm based on megawatts or based on electricity production annually will be shared with either the local residents or the local municipality, or both. For example, in the case of Estonia, it's 50-50 for onshore wind farms, and for offshore wind farms, it will be 100% of the money will go to the municipality. The pros of this approach are that, of course, money increases the motivation of people to accept something. The cons of this approach is that it might be perceived in some cases as bribery by residents. It has come up in surveys and when talking to people. And when the money goes to the municipality, the funds might not be used in the way that the local community will want, but it might go to just filling the holes in the municipal budget. Second, we have community benefit funds. So this is also a version of financial compensation, but rather than going directly to the people, it goes to a specific fund. Usually it's some sort of an NGO, a non-profit organization that administers the fund. And then the NGO will decide on how they will distribute the money. Usually they will have project proposals submitted by the local people, and then the NGO will decide on based on some criteria which projects will be funded and which not. For example, for building a local playground, a kindergarten, or doing something to enhance biodiversity in the wind farm area. The pros of this approach is that it urges the community to self-organize in the NGO and in administering the fund, and gives them a bigger say in distributing the funds. The cons are that it might create unnecessary bureaucracy, and it might become burdensome and more difficult to receive the money than just handing it out directly. And the distribution of funds might not be transparent. It will depend on who is in charge of the fund and who is a member of the NGO that is in charge of the fund. Then thirdly, we have co-ownership. This means that some amount of shares of the company that owns the wind farm will be shared with the local people, and they will be able to become shareholders in the company and co-owners, so to speak. Of course, the pros are that this creates a sense of ownership, but not only a sense of ownership, but actual ownership of local people within the wind farm. And it might lead to larger financial gains in the long term than just compensation. The cons are that there might be a lack of interest and also a lack of financial means to actually purchase the shares, which is something that we have seen also in the richer countries, such as in Denmark, where it has been a problem, I believe. Søren can correct me if I'm wrong. And there also might be a lack of willingness from developers to offer shares. And in some cases, it might lead to fraud, where, for example, people who actually live a long way from the wind farm, they will start registering their place of residence near the wind farm for some amount of time, so that they can buy up the shares, and then actually not be affected by the wind farm because they live somewhere else. And then fourthly, there is support for energy communities. So local people becoming developers of the solar farm or the wind farm themselves, or developing the farm together with a larger developer. And governments can support energy communities by, for example, financing. There's some sort of pre-studies, pre-analysis that needs to be done for developing, and also giving them special conditions in tenders, for example, public tenders. And the pros are that it also urges the community to self-organize, become proactive, and become a partner for the larger developer and a partner for the municipality. And it also might lead to larger financial gains in the long term. The cons are that, of course, the community might lack financial means, or they also might lack the technical know-how to start an energy community, because they actually need to be developers and co-owners themselves in a field that is very, very technical and very capital intensive. And it also might split the community in two. For example, when the energy community is perceived as the privileged few, or the ones that have the money or the know-how to start the energy community. And lastly, there is, of course, better communication, which enables to actually solve conflicts by addressing people's emotions, people's worries and needs, and the better communication can enable to create a strong and lasting partnership between the developer and the municipality and the community. So when the problems they have are actually heard, are actually solved, rather than just organizing information meetings where there is one-way flow of information, so to speak. And the cons are that this is usually a process that takes a long time. So building trust and building a good partnership is a long process, and in some cases it might not be possible because there will always be some people who are against anything, and in some cases there might be more of these people, and in some cases less. So, and of course, as was said before, we are in a hurry with developing renewable energy. So solutions that take a long time are not always that easy to implement. This is just a short overview of these 5 practices in some of the European countries, in UK, in Ireland, in Denmark, in Germany, and Estonia. This is information from a few years ago, so it might be a little bit outdated, I apologize. But in general, we can see that financial compensation is obligatory in most countries. Community benefit funds are obligatory in some and voluntary in others. Co-ownership is mainly voluntary. Financial support for energy communities exists in all of the countries mentioned, except for Estonia. And a good practice guide for communication, or some sort of a guiding material, or an agreement of how we communicate between the developer and the municipality and the community. This also exists in most of the countries, but not yet in Estonia. So we have some room for development. So to sum up, what I wanted to say is that there is a diverse range of options available for engaging the local community, but communities are very different, and they have different needs and different contexts. So it would be good if these options were available in countries, and that they could all be used depending on the needs. But ultimately, no financial benefit or no other scheme can replace good communication between developers, the local residents, and the local community. So we really should keep in mind on how to be respectful, how to be open, and how to practice hearing others people's needs and wants and worries, and how to try to actually address them rather than just swipe them under the carpet and going ahead like we planned. So thank you. This was my talk, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other talks with you here.
Yeah, thank you, Silver, for your presentation. And Ingrid and Krista, if you would like to go ahead and start.
Yes, thank you. I will share my screen then. So first of all, great thanks for the Green Movement for putting this webinar together, and thank you, Rena, for your introduction before. So I am Krista from Tartu University in Estonia, and recently, just last year, we put together a report about biodiversity in solar parks. And this is what I will shortly introduce you in this session. The publication is also available for everyone on this webpage, but it is unfortunately only in Estonian. Nevertheless, I will now tell you some of the main points then. One of the most important things is, of course, we all know that we need to transition, and rather quickly, from the fossil fuels to renewable energy. Unfortunately, a lot of the climate actions that we take, especially in the energy sector, do not always have a very good biodiversity effect. And since we also have a biodiversity crisis going on, then this is not a very good thing. In this graph, the blue lines show the actions that are good for climate and biodiversity both. And the red lines then show the actions that are good for climate, but not so for biodiversity. However, in the energy sector, there is solar energy in this graph that is the only one that's noted with blue. And that indeed is true. Solar energy farms can actually promote biodiversity, but only if we do it right. And how to do that right? When transitioning to renewable energy, the most important thing is that we do not harm nature. Like I said, the two crises that we have, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, they are so entwined that we cannot actually solve one without solving the other. Plus, if we change a little bit our way of thinking, our habits, then actually by taking nature into every decision as an equal partner, alongside with economic and social factors, we can actually do the switch and actually start increasing biodiversity and ecosystem services, even when building solar farms and producing energy. It is possible. For instance, in the UK, it is already obligatory to increase biodiversity of the site or the region of the place where you build any new solar park. These biodiverse production landscapes, where biodiversity and either the production of energy, food, or materials coexist, this really is possible. And in the future, this really is our only choice, because we humans, we just take up so much of the land that we can't just say anymore that, okay, we are here and the nature goes there. There's just so much of us, and the nature does not have enough room anymore, especially because already the degradation and the loss of nature and species, ecosystem services is already impacting ourselves too and our well-being. So the biodiverse production landscapes where the both are joined together, this really is our only way out. But how to do that? Well, in a solar park, the first thing to always keep in mind when doing any decision is to follow the mitigation hierarchy. So first of all, to try to avoid any damage that we can do. If it's not possible to avoid, then at least try to reduce it as much as possible. If we cannot even reduce it, we have to do some damage, then at least to try to restore the habitats or the species populations that were there beforehand. And as a last resort, then also try to compensate the damage that we have done, probably then usually somewhere else. And again, with the small switch in our thinking, it is possible to also restore something, do something good for the nature that was already previously or before was degraded or damaged. Some examples of that, how to avoid doing damage. Well, the first one, of course, is not to build in the nature, to build somewhere else, combine solar parks with already existing structures. Or then if we have to build in the nature, then use land that was already degraded or somehow used by people that is not in such a good condition anymore. Because that's where we can do the most harm, when we build solar parks in places, in habitats that are in really good condition or are even protected. Also, for instance, forests, where you have to just clear everything away and really damage the ecosystem, all these places should completely be avoided. Also, when building solar parks in the nature, we need to make sure that we do not reduce the connectivity of natural habitats, for instance, the green belts, or cut species migration routes. And also a small thing, even maybe the smallest to do, is just to retain all the landscape elements that are in the place where we're building the new park. Some ways how to mitigate the damage that we are doing. Well, there are actually a lot of technical options already out there for it, for what kind of foundations we do for a solar park, which kind of panels to use, what kind of fences. One of the best things to do actually is to simply leave more space between the rows of solar panels. In this picture, for instance, there is two solar parks from Germany. The southern one has the gap between the two panel rows 2 meters, and the upper one has 5.5 meters. And when looking at the biodiversity in those parks, scientists found that the northern park had 40% more species, and all the protected species they found were only in the northern park. So the benefit for nature from leaving more space is really clear and obvious. Just to have more ground where sun can hit the ground this is basically all that the species often need, just some space and a little opportunity. Also, one thing that can be done in every single park that already exists is to maintain it biodiversity friendly, using management that can help both plant species diversity and also the animals to thrive in a solar park. It is possible in every single park that already exists. And in addition, it is possible to also restore nature and actually increase the species richness of the place. It's the easiest, I suppose, if you build your park in a contaminated site, an old landfill, a mining area, something like this, but also degraded arable lands that have been already abandoned for one reason or another. It is also always a good choice to try to increase landscape connectivity, either by, for instance, plotting hedgerows that can then make small green corridors in the landscape, or actually even using the solar park itself as a landscape element. For instance, in the really large and monotonous, intensive agricultural areas, a nature-rich solar park can be a beautiful landscape element. And it can also provide pollination service and pest management, because in good quality grasslands are very good sources for both pollinators and for pest natural enemies. And actually, managing a solar park as a good quality species-rich meadow is actually one of the best things that we can do, because, well, obviously it's not a forest and never will be, but it can be a meadow. And meadows are one of the most species-rich habitats that we have anyway. So managing your solar park as a meadow, other than by mowing or grazing, so that to increase species richness is an absolutely good thing in every single park. Some examples here. This is Sondorf Solar Park from Germany. Well, it has a long history. It actually used to be a gravel pit, which was then filled with building rubble, then covered with topsoil and actually used for agriculture for several years before it was then turned into a nature-friendly solar park. In this park, they used fences that let smaller animals pass. And all around the solar park, there's plenty of space for a nice species-rich grassland with local species. There is also even a small coppice of trees in the northern part of the park here. And they planted 4,000 shrubs all around the edges here. So there's a very nice space also for both producing solar energy and for the nature. Oh yeah, even 2 ponds they dug, although I couldn't quite find them on this scheme here. But, well, all the better for the frogs. There are also very good opportunities to cooperate with agricultural farms. There are, again, very many possibilities with both animal husbandry and growing crops. I cannot go into this more detailed, but it's a fascinating, different world altogether. But it's also very good for nature because it takes away some pressure from the nature, because the land use efficiency in then this agricultural areas becomes greater, and there is less need to build in the natural areas. Also, by using solar energy, the farmers can reduce their farms and food production's carbon footprint. And it even has a bit of a social benefit there by giving a sort of an insurance for the farmers. So even if the crops should fail, they still can get some benefits from producing the solar energy. For cooperation with communities, there are also other options. Similarly to the wind farms, there can also be community-owned solar farms, or the solar farms can be used for instance, education. And why not, again, combine it with nature, so that you can educate people at the same time about renewable energy and the benefits of having species-rich nature around you. Another example of a truly multifunctional park is Care Farm de Mikkelhorst in the Netherlands. This farm is being built in an old polder area with a lot of ditches in the site. So they actually use ditches instead of fences, already bringing benefits for, well, keeping the historical structure of the landscape and also for the nature, because there's no impediment of movement there. They also plan to plant fruit trees and shrub crops, mainly then for producing berries, and also graze some cattle in between these areas. why is it a socially good project is that most of the work in this this farm is actually done by people with disabilities who then have a safe place to work to whatever their ability is then. Also for local residents, they can invest in the farm, and it's also used as a recreation area. A third example is our own biodiversity pilot project in a solar park in Estonia that will be built now next year. We have been working with a company here that wanted to try out how to increase the biodiversity in their solar park, and maybe also find some cheaper ways for themselves to manage the park. It is an old arable land, about 11 hectares in size, and well, there isn't that much to preserve, except for a few small things there. There is, on the eastern side of the plot, there's a small patch of woodland and the ditch that will be both left just as they are. There is a small island of shrubs here. And well, there is also still a ditch, which we also, at first, we planned to keep it as it is, but unfortunately, since it was once upon a time illegally dug there, then it will still be filled up, unfortunately. But we will do a little twist there too, not to lose this habitat entirely. So thinking of the criteria that I told you before, we will try to retain what is there and enhance and restore what could be there, what could be better. The one limitation with this site is, both for the solar park engineers and for the biodiversity engineers, is that it has a very dense drainage grid underneath the ground. So there's some limitation to where you can put the solar panels, and also limitations for us because, for instance, we cannot go and plant any trees there because they could, well, damage the drainage system. So from the solar park developers, this is the kind of the plan that we got, and the green lines are all then the panels, how they will be placed. There is about 5 meters of space between each row, and these purple lines here in the middle are the ditches. Where will we the cable ditches? Yes, the cables go under the ground. So even at first sight, it might seem that there isn't that much space for nature there, especially compared to some of the examples I showed before. But well, there is some space here, and because it's a very big farm, that actually these patches here are quite good in size, in fact. So what do we plan to do there? We first of all want to bring in some biodiversity elements to increase biodiversity by having then dead wood there as logs and also piles of branches. We will add some sandy habitats, both wet and dry, and some rock piles. Then I'm not sure that we will be able to plant any shrubs, again, because of the drainage of the area, but we will ask a permit for that, and hopefully, at least in some places, we can add some bushes as well. And all these biodiversity elements will be put there then to bring in species, to create habitats for different species, from then fungi to lichens, mosses, reptiles, amphibians, small mammals, birds. Even the small, simple elements can actually have a lot of life in them. And most of the area there, we do plan to manage as a native grassland, to bring in some native local Estonian seeds. And because, well, it is a field right now, and it's quite a moist place. So in best case, it can be like a moist grassland, wet grassland. But definitely we want to try to use biodiversity-friendly management to create also with management small microhabitats with a little bit different conditions, and to make sure that then plants flowering in different seasons and also different insects can have a home there. I quickly show you the plan. So close to the woodlands, like in the eastern side here, and in the southwestern corner, we plan to put then the dead wood objects to, and if possible, then also some shrubs to kind of support the woody habitats that we have either in the site or close by. Oh yes, there is in the southwest corner, there was a small patch of trees and not on this land, but on the neighboring one. So we try to support them that little patch there too. And in the eastern side, there was also the ditch. So the piles of branches can also work as overwintering places for some amphibians. Now this old ditch here in the western part of the site that I showed you before, this will be filled up indeed, but we will try to make it into like a sandy, slightly wet habitat. So it will not have the same vegetation, but hopefully it will still have something that increases the species richness, that brings in species that otherwise would not be in the site. The field itself is mostly the clay soil, but just a couple of kilometers away, actually, there are very nice dune systems, then both with dry and wet sandy habitats. So for the wider landscape, these sandy elements actually fit in very nicely. Also, one orchid that was growing just here next to the ditch, we have already replanted into this small shrubby island. So hopefully we can also save this one. It's a protected species in Estonia, so hopefully it will survive. In the northern part here, we will create a sandy habitat, but a dry one this time. It will be like higher from the general ground, try to add a little bit of terrain, so it can be a good nesting place for some sand-loving bees, and also, of course, for any other creature or that likes a sandy and a bit drier habitat. In the ends there, we also plan to add the rock piles, and for reptiles, and again, any lichen that likes to live on a stone. Hopefully, we can also add some hedges here and in the western part along the road, and hopefully also in the northern part, although that might not work out. The drainage system is a bit too close. Oh, we'll see. We have to ask for permit. These cable ditches we plan to use for putting down seeds of the native plants then, and also making small establishment gaps all over the place in the area to give the native species a better chance of establishing their populations and then spreading out into the rest of the area. So with some small, simple structures and methods, we can actually increase the biodiversity in this park, I hope, by quite a good extent. When we find out, I guess maybe we can let you know. With this, I wrap up the biodiversity part, and Ingrid will continue with people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krista. We would definitely like to talk about this furthermore, but we have limited time today, so I'll try and give some context to the project with my next couple of slides as well. Oh, I have to go and skip all Krista's slides. Let's see, how far are we? Okay. All righty. So maybe something that to give a context to this park furthermore is that in Estonia, this consideration of biodiversifying or even just mitigating the effects of any technical installation is not very widespread. So we're really talking about the very first steps that we're doing. And with this pilot, we are hoping to at least maybe not crumble some barriers, at least make little headway in order to really spread the knowledge in practical terms as well. And this particular park, we started working on it about a year ago. It was not that we started working on this particular park, but in order to find even someone who would be willing to test the pilots, because of the fact that we didn't have already a line behind our door. We had to work quite a lot and talk to many different people in the sector in order to actually find this opportunity. So it's a much longer process than maybe even I anticipated in the beginning, and we've already had to redo some of our plans a couple of times because things take time. But So what are the challenges in running a pilot like this, or in even trying to change the common narrative around energy production? Energy production has so far been very monopolized business. It's a very specific field. Therefore, there are several barriers to be overcome, and it's not only the developers that have their own sort of like bubbles that need to be broken or at least expanded. We're talking about many different stakeholders. So one of the things that we've encountered in working with this is the barrier of understanding. So barrier of understanding, quite frankly, just comes from the fact that in general, people do not have a good idea or a good grasp on ecology. They have a very vague idea of what is biodiversity. Often it doesn't match what we think by biodiversity. And to put it really blunt, people have a very simplified idea on how to fix issues around biodiversity. I'm not saying that this is only pertaining to the energy sector. It's actually common in all of the different sectors that we've come across in our work. So it's one of those things that needs to be broken. We have more luck with people who have worked in environmental topics before, but if we are approaching engineers, for instance, then it's a work that needs a full-on educational aspect tied to it as well. So that's one of the things. The other part of this understanding is, of course, is that when we have this theoretical understanding, that we have the common understanding, then how to put it into practical means that remains the second major roadblock on this way. So in order to, for instance, with our talks with different developers, we found out that they want easy, simple, and quick solutions to the biodiversity issue that they already are starting to recognize that they have. Of course, working with ecologists, working with scientists, biologists, you quickly understand that it isn't so. And that can sometimes delay processes because people have hard time coming to sort of like understanding, not coming to the terms with the fact that this isn't an easy process. But we, of course, with this pilot as well, we've tried to keep it in a way that there's not too much pressure, that instead we're looking for the opportunities and looking for ways on how to make this more pleasurable for everyone. Then another bit is that there are very many different stakeholders who have all of them have their own individual bubbles, and this project is clearly showcasing the fact that you're not just dealing with a developer or maybe local municipality or with local people, but you have many different stakeholders that all have their interest. They all have their own understanding of what is needed, what is necessary, what is beautiful, etc. And they all come together. For instance, in a solar park, you would have stakeholders like a local municipality, especially if we're talking about large-scale production, who will have to, take care that their green areas or even their agricultural lands are well managed. Then we're talking about local people very often. With this particular park, this isn't the case because it's quite far from households. It is in the middle of an agricultural land, so there's less of that. Of course, we still haven't spoken to the closest neighbor. Maybe he'll have some comments and complaints, but hopefully he'll be a big supporter to this. And then we also have the developers themselves. Then we have ecologists or nature advocates who have their own say in this. Then, of course, there's also no park is generally built and managed by the same company. So we have very many different stakeholders coming in, and there needs to be extensive and very open communication about it. And it's definitely something that goes out of the traditional way of managing solar parks in general. And then, of course, there's a larger societal aspect to it as well. It's our businesses are profit oriented and arguing for the ecosystem benefits, which they often don't see as their own benefits, but as benefits that expand way beyond what they're usually used to dealing with. This remains something that actually requires a more general educational approach in society. But these are some of the challenges besides the technical ones that Krista briefly explained as well. But I'd like to talk more about the opportunities that there are, because I realize that I'm talking to a lot of colleagues today who might be interested in seeing the same processes happening in their own countries. So some of the opportunities we have found are quite significant. One of those things is finding support in the framework. If we have a society, if we're talking about European countries, we have different strategies from the EU side coming up. There's the biodiversity strategy. These are all supporting frameworks that can be put to good use. When this report was created, it didn't come from out of the blue. It was because different parties are looking for solutions, and they were hoping that the report itself would also provide this gap or this way in order to find better solutions to this very quick expansion of solar parks. In Estonia, particularly, solar parks often are placed on agricultural lands, especially when we're talking about large-scale ones. So this was one of the reasons why this report was initiated in the beginning, to find a solution to the different conflicts coming up. This particular project of ours is definitely an example of collaborative approach, and running this pilot serves one goal, to showcase exactly what Krista said. It is possible. And even though we are dealing with a park that is very traditional in its technical build, in the way that it has been planned, there hasn't been step one, so to say, engaging a landscape specialist into this from the very, very beginning. So we are seeing what we're seeing is that we need to keep a very open mind in who do we bring into this project, how do we solve the different expectations that people have, and we need to keep a very collaborative approach with the pilots. Of course, with time passing and people becoming more knowledgeable about biodiversity issues, which is still quite unknown. If we talk about the climate crisis in general, people do not even realize how biodiversity is linked into this. We do expect that this kind of collaborative approach becomes much more creative and becomes like an established norm. And then there's the public nudging part as well. We're running this project, keeping truly open, communicative aspect going, talking about it everywhere. We have a good partner in the sense that they also recognize that their small steps do contribute to the public nudging as well. So one of those aspects to keep in mind when launching these kinds of pilots is communicating throughout different steps. And this webinar is one of those attempts to use this public nudging tool. We have organized some webinars earlier, and we have some upcoming ones as well with different stakeholders with different approaches to how do we present this information as well, in order to truly nudge on the move towards better practices. We've put together my time is running out, but I won't describe these, but we put together a list of different links that are very useful materials from different countries that expand way beyond our solar parks as well. There's the Integrated Vegetation Management Guide, which is for the electrical grids, which was released in August 2023. Agri-solar best practices guidelines were renewed this year, again, providing more opportunities opportunities, more examples on how to get away from this mono usage in the energy production. Nature Capital best practice guidance is actually a guidance directed at developers themselves on the steps that they could be taking. It's a UK based, but we found that it's relevant even here up in the north and most probably also in the south. Then Sweden has put together very nice guidelines on solar parks and biodiversity, describing maybe more the scientific side and scientific opportunities in it. And then Spanish colleagues have also released a report on how to reconcile the deployment of renewables with our common concerns about biodiversity. So these are some of those things. And before I move to the summary, which you can read here, this is the summary of the steps that a developer and should keep in mind. I'd also like to say that even though today we're not talking to local municipalities, local governments, there are ways in order to create better practices with them as well, for them as well. One of those things is definitely that in order to start developing parks, local governments can set the terms and conditions of the parks themselves, and there can be extensive and thorough communication between different parties in order to make sure that the best solution is found. So we're looking forward to elaborating and exploring this more and coming up with suggestions, more concrete suggestions to different stakeholders as well. But today I'd like to thank you for your attention. Hope you found this useful. You will be able to we'll leave our contacts as well with Krista, so you'll be able to ask any questions beyond today as well later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you both for your great presentation. That was super informative and really good information. Søren, would you like to start with your presentation now?
Of course. Thank you, Rina. First of all, thank you for inviting me to speak at your event here. It's very exciting. So my name is Søren Enghoff. I'm head of regulatory affairs and impact at Spore, a Norwegian company that you're going to hear a little bit about today, but also both what we do, but also why we do what we do. My background is a biologist, a marine biologist. I've been working in the private sector as an offshore wind developer, but also as a permitting authority in Denmark, the Danish Energy Agency. And I've been with Spore for the last year. So we are a 3-year-old company, nearly 3-year-old company, 22 people based in Oslo. And we're working in the nature coexistence space, you could say. And there can be many good reasons for that, of course. But to sort of highlight at least one point, which the ones of you that are working in the wind sector and maybe in the renewable sector in general will recognize is a quote from this recent Nature publication that this is looking at offshore wind only, but I think you could claim the same for any renewable sector. That environmental risks are simply one of the most important potential barriers to the deployment and ambitions for renewable energy. So it's not just sort of the environmental risk related to the known risk of wind farms. It's also all the uncertainties. So what we don't know, species interactions that we don't quite understand, cause-effect relationships, etc. And these are sort of you can say one of the drivers for what we're doing. And I'm going to explain more about what we're doing a little bit later. But we're dealing in the company mainly with birds in relation to wind farms and understanding potential impacts in relation to wind farms. And the study I showed before goes on, and this is a literature review, and quite clearly identifies that there are many studies that are identifying potential negative impacts on different environmental parameters. And the vast majority of these are about birds. So birds are a big risk, you could say, when you're talking offshore wind farms, but also onshore wind farms. And not surprisingly, the bird species that are most prominent in these studies are species that you find in the North Sea, because that's where we have most of the offshore wind farms and most of the studies. But that leaves us also with an important finding, that there are many, many species that we have very little information about in terms of how they interact with wind farms. So that's in particular important for wind farm markets that are not in the North Sea. So there are many species where the knowledge base is simply very, very little. And it goes back to the point from Krista earlier, the mitigation hierarchy, that clearly what you want to do first is to plan your way out of problems, so avoid introducing a problem. But before that, you need to have sort of the basics, you need to have knowledge, you need to have understanding on these cause-effect relationships, and often we really do not have that. So that's what we are sort of trying to build products for. So we are a software company. So we use very good video cameras to record birds and also bats in relation to wind farms before and after you construct wind farms. And our sort of competence, you could say, or our edge, is that we are developing these software solutions, building on AI principles, where we can automate the analysis of these very, very large data sets that we are collecting. We have, you could say, overall sort of 3 product categories: pre-construction monitoring, post-construction monitoring, and based on these sort of 2, you could say, main products, and these sort of core algorithms, we are now building a turbine-specific shutdown on demand solution, or it's also known as a curtailment solution, where you in real time can risk assess individual birds and shut down the turbines if they are at risk and cannot be at risk. Clearly, there are some species that are more protected than others. So being a software company, we are still quite a lot relying on cameras. So we're using off-the-shelf cameras. So that means cameras that we can go readily available and buy in the market. And the cameras we use are sort of in the range of qualities from very good to the best you can possibly find in the market. And that gives us a really interesting advantage, that we can use different cameras in different situations and different solutions. So we can scope for different projects, basically what cameras are best to use in these situations, and also in that way find cost efficiencies. But it also gives us, and this may be the most important part, it also gives us a chance to tap into a camera industry that is developing really, really fast on its own. So we can tap into all of these new developments, new camera models that are coming online, because they get outdated after 3 to 5 years. So we record video, and one camera would record maybe 4,500 of hours per year. Just one camera. So that's really a lot of data, very, very high resolution video data. And you don't want a person to sit down and look through all of that. So we are automating that process with our software, where we are extracting all the relevant data points that are relating to birds, or as I mentioned, we're also starting to look a little bit at bats, but we're extracting all the relevant information for birds and translating that into a dashboard our clients has access to. And that can be used as sort of a license to operate in terms of reporting towards authorities or other relevant stakeholders. Before I go on and show you some video examples of how it looks, I just want to show you here that these are typically sort of the things that resonates with our clients. So working with us gives them something to talk about in terms of biodiversity, sustainability targets, investor relations, and in general with stakeholders. It kind of goes back to the point from Silva and the study Silva presented earlier, that environmental impacts has to be quite low to gain public acceptance and support. And that's why we see many of our clients, which are typically developers, they have very strong biodiversity policies and targets, and we are sort of speaking straight into that. Another category in the middle here is the tender award criteria. That's in particular for offshore wind farms, but potentially could also be in some situations onshore. But more and more countries are introducing non-price factors. So instead of just evaluating who wins a site based on only price, they're introducing other factors such as sustainability, biodiversity, public engagement, other factors, and we can be a factor in that play. And then lastly, and that's perhaps the most important one, permitting conditions. So simply meeting regulation requirements that you need to do pre-construction monitoring, you need to do post-construction monitoring. Maybe in some cases you have to do curtailment, these things. So I'm going to show you some examples because it can be a little bit abstract to talk about AI and video and stuff without seeing it. So the sort of general approach we're using is called computer vision, and we're using sort of a theory called optical flow, where we're basically looking for movements. So we're looking for things that are moving, but only birds, clearly. So what happens here is that after a few frames, so the algorithm will compare frame by frame. You'll compare all the pixels in the frame. If there are pixel coloration changes, that will indicate there's something moving. And so we've trained the algorithm to detect movements from birds, but not other stuff. So we have told it, for instance, that the turbine is not a bird, and other things that are moving are sort of filtered out. So in this case, we're looking at an offshore turbine outside of Norway at a test center. We're looking towards the one called Tetraspar. You can see a little bit of the data to the right there. The camera is positioned at another one called Zephyrus, and you can see the distance of the bird to these turbines, the flying height, flying trajectory, stuff like that. And then because we have very, very high resolution cameras, we can have even these very far distances. We can have a digital zoom in where we can identify not just it's a bird, but also to species level. So our in-house ornithologist will do that. And by doing that, he's training our AI. So while I finish this point, I'll just show it again. So as I said, we're very good at detecting a bird, but to detect what species it is, we really need to train the AI to do it automatically. So AI is not a magical button you just press. You have to train your algorithms, and that's what we're doing by labeling the data. So he will only look at, or our biologists will only look at the videos that contain bird data, not the total amount of video that, for a large proportion of the time, there won't be any birds. And this kind of information, flying heights, flying trajectories, are these things that you want to understand to plan your wind farms in a sustainable way. So for wind farms, sometimes you could maybe consider a higher hop height. So simply putting the turbine up higher if you realize the birds are flying quite low to avoid collision risk, or flying trajectories can be used to also plan the layout of the wind farm. The next video is onshore, and you have to pay attention here because it will be very difficult for you to see the bird that is crossing this wind farm. But it's also to show that even in pretty poor visibilities, we can see birds. So there will be a green line crossing from left to right. So let's see if you can detect it. I'll just pause it here. So there's a green dotted line here, a bird being tracked. You can hardly see the rotor is spinning, but it is just spinning. And this is also an interesting site for us. We've been there for, I think, nearly 2 years, and it's close to an airport. So it's a good training situation for us to train the algorithm to filter out planes. Also insects at summer. If insects are getting too close to the camera, it could look like birds. So we're also training for what's an insect to avoid false positives. Another example is nighttime. So this is where we're a little bit more immature, I have to say. So here we have an offshore wind farm where we are trying out if our algorithm actually works on this different data stream. Can we detect a bird on thermal video? And quite clearly we can. So I think the distance maybe here is 500, 600 meters, as I recall, and it's some gull. I don't know which one. So it works quite well, actually. You get a very clear signature from thermal videos. And we have now also recently started a little bit to look at using thermal onshore to look at bats. Actually, bats are also a potential risk offshore in many projects. Few people realize that. So quite clearly, our algorithm also works with a thermal video for bats. So this is a dead of night in the forest outside of Oslo. And we were quite excited to see that it works so well. And it's interesting that with these cameras that can potentially have a longer range than the normal way to detect bats, which is by acoustic, so a microphone that cannot detect bats for more than 100 meters, and they don't quite clearly know where the bat is. They can just, there's a bat nearby. So with these, you can potentially monitor for bats further away and also position them where they are. And that's important for many reasons. And one of them is that there are some bats that are flying higher than 100 meters. You need to understand that the wind farms here and the turbines, they are quite high and also up to 300 meters. So there are bats that you don't see in microphone recordings or here that could be in the risk area. So we're also doing a verification study externally now in Scotland with the client Vattenfall and a scientific partner BTO that are sort of verifying the technology. I'm just showing this here also to show you two of the cameras we're using there. Normally we use one camera, but we're trying to triangulate the position of the birds there and to see how much more precision we're getting with that. And also to get that verification from a trusted external partner here is quite important for us. And what's interesting to learn here is also that what we are being told also by them and others, we don't need to be 100% precise in what we do. We just need to understand the inaccuracy, and then you can build that into your impact assessments. The last product I'm going to show is on pre-construction monitoring. So we've started putting cameras on wave buoys. You're putting these wave buoys out before you construct wind farms typically to measure wind speeds. So yeah, they're called FLIDARs. And they have a laser that can measure the wind speeds very high, at the hop height basically. So we put out these cameras to sort of piggyback on these campaigns and then capture good quality bird data at the same time. And we're quite excited about that because it's going pretty well, to be honest. So the campaign before, I should say, this is 140 kilometers offshore in the North Sea. It's pretty calm that day, but we've been out in 11-meter wave heights and it still records. Everything works. It's pretty cool. So normally what you do when you do pre-construction monitoring for offshore wind farms is you use a plane, sometimes a vessel if it's a little bit more near shore, and then you do these very long transects and cover not the whole site, but most of the site. So they have very big spatial coverage. That's an advantage. But they have very low temporal resolution. So they're only out there for a few days per month, maybe a few days per season. They're only out there in good weather. Sometimes the birds scare away the planes scare away the birds. So there are a lot of biases with these methodologies, but these are what we have today to deal with. And what we are sort of making here is an alternative where you have maybe lower spatial coverage, but you're having higher temporal resolution. So the cameras will be there for the full year, maybe more if the campaign is more. So you capture that granularity of when are birds actually there, much more detailed compared to traditional methods. So it's giving you a whole new insights that you cannot get from traditional methods. So that's quite interesting. A nice way to de-risk your projects quite early on to fully understand what's out there. There's just one problem, and that is our when you put out a camera on a buoy, and this is very near shore before we put it offshore, it just bounces around and rolling around in the water. And we're looking for movements. And when everything moves as it does to the left, we cannot use our software. So we made an additional software package where we can stabilize the picture according to the horizon, which will be a stable reference all the time. And then our algorithm works quite well. So as I mentioned, we've been doing that in seriously harsh conditions in the North Sea now, and we're quite excited about its working. So I'm sort of coming to the to the end now. I'm almost asking myself here, aren't there any alternatives to these pretty high-tech environmental monitoring techniques? Well, clearly there are alternatives. There are many great environmental consultancies with superb experts in ornithology, passionate people that are truly awesome. But, and this is the but, and that is what we are sort of also speaking into with this kind of new technology. This is a little bit text heavy, of course. This is showing some numbers from very recent, it's from October, a publication from GWO and GWEC, so Global Wind Organization and Global Wind Energy Council, showing what is the expected workforce we need to install the ambitions up until 2027 and also operate them. But this is technical personnel. So the first graph on the top is the skills we need to build and install wind farms, and the second one, those that needs to operate the wind farms. And we need a workforce expansion that is pretty massive to meet these targets. And the same basically applies for environmental consultancies. So they cannot meet the demand at all, not even close, because they're meeting stricter and stricter requirements for environmental surveys before and after construction. So they need to do more. And they also need to do more in other sectors. So there are also other sectors they're working for that also are seeing higher and higher environmental requirements, because we're being more and more concerned also about cumulative impacts. So somewhere between 9 and 29% is sort of the expected requirement for new ornithologists to meet this requirement just until 27. So we are an alternative, you could say, to that very, very labor-intensive field work that these consultancies have to do, and being a data provider to them to get these reports and environmental assessments done. The alternative is that we don't do environmental assessments, or we do them very, very poorly. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for your presentations. This was super awesome and informative. We have so far 3 questions in the Q&A that I'll just go ahead and ask the first one, and whoever feels like they want to answer this, then you can jump in and answer, and we'll go from there. But the first question says, who is financing creating wind parks? Is there any public money used for this? So if anyone has an answer, that would be great.
Well, I think the experts from Bankwatch that maybe are also on the line are the ones that know the best. But what I can say is that yes, there is public money spent in several countries, and also in Estonia. We used to have feed-in tariffs, and now we have auctions. So yes, there is some amount of public money.
Okay, then for our next question, it says, which areas are considered biodiversity reach? Are Natura 2000 sites or only national protected areas like national parks? What criteria do you consider when you talk about rich biodiversity rich areas?
I suppose this one I can take. Actually, well, what we meant in our report, how we defined it, is that basically any place that is in a good natural state. So definitely the Natura 2000, the directive areas should be avoided when building, especially the big or the middle scale solar farms. So, but yes, if at all possible, then anything that hasn't been touched by people and is in a good condition should be avoided. How to define that, what is in a good condition? Actually, in Estonia, we now have a tool for this. There was actually 2 large projects that have been done over the last few years, have defined, there's a map about the whole Estonia actually that defines whether a site is in a good place, a medium scale, or in a bad state. So this one can be used now by the local governments for these planning efforts.
I'd like to add to this as well. Not sure about the state of sensitivity mapping in other countries, but I do know that sensitivity mapping has been done in several European countries, as well as some countries, including Estonia, have at least done the preliminary mapping down or establishing the green infrastructure areas as well, which consist of very different areas under different conservation and usage statuses. So it's a very particular question in a sense that if you'd like to know more about it, the first way would be to see what is the status of Natura 2000 areas in your country, as well as how is the green infrastructure established, etc. So can't give a very precise information here.
I can maybe continue with a little bit of an angle to reflecting on the question. Also, there's an interesting sort of situation where EU countries have to designate areas for go-to areas or energy parks, etc. So places where you can fast track the permitting process and roll out renewables quite fast. And that's a great idea. And you have to designate areas that are not biodiversity sensitive. And the problem with that is kind of turning it around. The problem with that is that we have very little clarity about what areas are not biodiversity sensitive. So we don't really have the full overview of, say, where do we not have bats? So bats are protected throughout the EU. Where do we not have bats? Who knows? You know, they're probably in most places, but we actually cannot fully answer that. So there are some of these sort of policy measures to fast track permitting that are still, they have the right intentions, but they can still be difficult to implement without actually impacting biodiversity, even though that is the whole purpose of it. So there was just a reflection on that.
Yeah, thank you for those answers. Our next question is actually directly to Søren. It says, did you investigate how many illbirds are flying directly into these windmill areas? And maybe are they by nature without needed capabilities?
I'm not sure I understand it 100%, but we have not investigated how many ill birds are flying into the windmill areas, and I don't know if you're referring to kind of if they, there are some birds that don't stand a chance to avoid these windmills. I think what I can say, one of the things that we're trying to explore with our technology is to get numbers on what's called micro avoidance rates. So how good are the different species in avoiding the turbines in the very last seconds before they potentially collide? So when they're very close to the turbine, how good are they at actually responding to that threat and then turning away? And the studies that have been done so far are all showing that they're pretty good at that. But there are many species that we don't have these numbers for. We don't have collision rates. When you talk offshore, you certainly don't have collision rates. Onshore, typically you will go out with a dog, like a carcass dog or a person to look for bird carcasses. And then by doing that, you can kind of estimate what is the collision rate of birds and bats. You clearly cannot do that offshore. So these collision rates and micro avoidance rates are some of the elements that we're trying to contribute to, so we get better understanding on the different species, so we can plan the wind farms better. And it is also a way to remove some of the conservatism layers that are in the impact assessments, because if you don't know better, you have to be a little bit conservative in your modeling, and that can have a consequence for the wind farm planning, basically, sort of for the whole business case also. So it is important that we understand how wildlife interacts with wind farms, not just for the sake of the wildlife, but also for the sake of the wind farms being planned in the right way, where we can squeeze out as much renewable energy as possible for these areas.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. The next question says, is the question how much energy is altogether needed in, I guess, both Europe and Estonia, if anyone knows the answer to that question?
Well, I can say I don't know that specifically, but I think if you look at that link, when you see the slides afterwards from the GWEC and GWO study I mentioned at the end, I think you will find some of the numbers there.
Yes, I can comment on that as well. There isn't a clear indication of how much energy is needed. Electricity consumption or the necessity for electricity with the transition to the renewable energy is definitely foreseen, but I think it remains a very difficult question, because we do know that our energy consumption at this point already exceeds the planetary boundaries, and that's a question that hasn't been even asked in a lot of ways. That currently EU is trying to tackle the energy use by energy efficiency measures, but we still haven't arrived to the point where we can talk about energy sufficiency as well. It's definitely a question upcoming in the next years, because different organizations have already predicted that with all our efforts in energy efficiency, with the renewable energy transition, still do not fit Paris compatible targets, nor do they support the biodiversity efforts that we have in EU as well.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Our next question says, how do you see the likelihood to increase the buy-in for biodiversity/community buy-in as non-price factors in auctions, but also maybe PPA contracts? Do you hear of appetite for this from developers or other parties?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think definitely there's a high likelihood for biodiversity becoming a more important factor in auction frameworks. That's quite clear. We're seeing that, and there are some interesting approaches to that, where we also, as a science community, are learning a lot by introducing requirements in this regard. But I think you're also speaking to an important point about the PPA contracts, because I think we will see a shift that as we're getting so much renewable energy in the grid and the mix, that it won't be enough just to have a renewable energy PPA. Like, okay, you have a factory that doesn't have CO2 emissions, that's very nice, but the next thing to also be good at is having a PPA that are also biodiversity friendly. So I think we will see that is not enough just to have energy from wind farms for your factory or whatever you have, but also that you can say the energy we have not killed all the birds, to put it very blunt. So I think we will see that. To my knowledge, we have not seen it, but I think we will see something along those lines.
Okay, on to our next question. How about the proximity of SPP to Natura 2000 and the density of development around Natura 2000? Why not tell where developers can develop and not set rules where they cannot?
Krista, would you like to take that first?
I can take the first part, I think. At least, about the building close to protected areas, both Natura 2000 and others. There's definitely a need to check out which species are living in these protected areas, because many of them also go outside the protected sites, of course. So if there's, let's say, an eagle nest close to the nature park's edge there, and they want to build a big solar park there, then yes, there should definitely be some sort of a buffer. But again, well, as scientists, we can only advise this, and which we also did in this report. So hopefully then the environmental board will also take this suggestion into account. But yeah, the rules are made by somebody else, of course. And some of them are also already set too, I believe.
Yes, I'd like to add to this that it is a policy question in general. We do know that in order to meet our biodiversity targets, we should assign up to 30% of both the onshore and offshore areas to protected areas in upcoming years. And I guess the discussions around it will only increase until we reach our set targets. It is a very difficult thing to say that this is only it should be like established firm rules of where you can or where you cannot, because landscapes are very different. Natura areas by themselves do not completely mean that you can't put up solar energy production there. It just needs to fall under the very small scale capacity. And also there's another aspect, is that I think with spatial planning picking up in all around Europe, and I don't mean only just regionally, but if we're looking at renewable energy expansion, we have to talk about the cumulative effects of different energy production. And I think statewide and even union-wide spatial planning will have to be addressed quite soon in order to make sure that we don't do individually so much damage that cumulatively it will start putting our biodiversity targets into danger.
I think you said a bit of what I wanted to say, but to continue on that, on the part that in the Natura 2000 area doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot have renewable energy close by, but you cannot impact the designation of the area. So if you are installing, say, a small solar park, maybe that's okay. Or if you are, and this is the point I want to reflect, or if you're sort of nurturing and tapping into these new technologies that can mitigate the impacts. So, for instance, when I mentioned curtailment for birds, these kind of technologies are sort of coming, and some of them are available, where you could potentially have also a large wind farm close to Natura 2000 and not impact it. So just to reflect on that nuance to Natura 2000.
Just a brief comment on the last part of the question, which I think is that this is actually the plan of the European Commission right now with the Repower EU package. Again, I'm not an expert, but I believe it's in the new Renewable Energy Directive that member states are now obligated to actually designate so-called go-to areas for renewable energy development. So and this is exactly what has been asked here, that we should tell developers where they can go instead of where they can't go. So these go-to areas are exactly the areas where the ecological impact will presumably be lower than elsewhere, and they are sort of the first places developers should look at.
Yeah, I fully agree, and it goes a little bit beyond that. There's also the Marine Spatial Planning Directive that is also dictating member states to plan their oceans. So they also have to designate areas due to that on where you potentially can have offshore energy. So I think there are different actually EU signals here that you have to tell the industry where they can and cannot be.
Yeah, thank you all for your answers to that question. Moving on to our next question says, how do you evaluate Latvia's decision to go into forest with onshore wind farms, since forests are high in ecosystem services?
I cannot speak to that specifically, apart from what we are hearing is that there will be some very strict regulation around onshore wind farms in Latvia, implementing curtailment on the wind farms. So I suppose, without knowing the full context, that these wind farms will have some very strict requirements for mitigating potential impacts, which I would fully support, but I don't know the details here.
Yes, unfortunately, I can't add much more to it. We have spoken to our Latvian colleagues about it, but it's the state's sovereign decision on how do they plan this and what kind of measures do they take to mitigate the effects. So unless there are some Latvians in the audience who could maybe share their point of view, I'm afraid we don't have the capacity to talk for Latvians. So.
All right, well, I think this wraps up most of the Q&A questions from the audience. Since we do just have a couple more minutes, I'll just ask one of the questions that I've prepared that I just thought of while we were listening to all of your presentations. Søren, I wanted to ask, are there different precautions you need to take between on and offshore wind when looking at, protecting the birds and biodiversity of the region? And how can AI be adjusted to fit these, different situations?
That's a fair question. I think so. When I was working at a developer and also with the energy agency, I was working on all environmental topics, like everything you can imagine. And there are clearly differences between on and offshore. But being very sort of focused on birds and bats now, the topic is very similar actually on and offshore. The main difference is the species are different, or sometimes they're different, and the habitats are quite different. So from a technical perspective and a logistical perspective, there are differences for us. So for instance, if we put up a camera and your line of sight is obstructed by, say, a forest or a hill or something, we cannot see through a hill or a forest. So there's something with our technological approach there that needs to be adapted, and we have to have a higher vantage point and stuff like that. But the software approach is the same. We're training in the same way, and so there are many similarities there. But going back to one of my first points, we need to adapt these technologies for different species in these different situations. So there are some tweaks we have to do with an overall similar approach, I would say.
Okay, well, I think that concludes all of the Q&A questions from the webinar today. So I just want to say thank you for all of your questions, and if there are any questions left over, then we'll make sure to answer them via email. Before we end today, just for your information, you will receive a recording of the webinar and the slides and a link to the EU survey on justice, rights, and values, where you can give your feedback on today's webinar. I would like to thank all of the speakers today and participants. With what being said, I think we can say goodbye. So have a nice evening, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.